Yeah.
Mr. Donna.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Nicole.
I haven't seen Anina.
Is she a co-presenter with you?
Oh, yes.
There's a very compelling case to be made about equitable schools, her favorite topic. We could do it later, or
No, that's,
if you wanna.
what am I doing? I'm looking at, because when this is done, I'm gonna.
Oh.
I'm just gonna be sitting there. She's the moderator.
Is there like service down here?
Not really.
No,
but
okay.
It's just my calendar.
Okay, welcome everyone here in the room and on Zoom to the fourth session in our series of discussions based on the book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. My name is LoBue, and I'm part of CURE, which stands for the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. We are a local, all-volunteer nonprofit dedicated to educating ourselves and our neighbors about systemic racism as a critical part of dismantling it. Before we get started, we have a few people and organizations we'd like to acknowledge. First, thank you to the County Board of Legislators for the funding for this second annual 5 Towns, 1 Book event, and County Legislator Catherine Parker for her consistent support of our work. This year, CURE partnered with LMC Media, the Westchester Library System, and the County Human Rights Commission. We are grateful to be working in concert with the 5 libraries of Harrison, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, New Rochelle, and Rye. And this afternoon, we shout out to librarian Laura Eckley for this beautiful Larchmont Library and the Village Center. This year, we have 20 additional county libraries that signed up to promote The Sum of Us and this event in their communities, in addition to participating in their own truth, racial healing, and transformation work inspired by Heather McGhee's book. If you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, McGhee focuses on how racism imposed costs on everyone, most vividly through the example of how in the 50s and 60s, communities in both the North and the South drained their public swimming pools rather than integrate them. She unpacks prevalent zero-sum thinking, or the idea that progress for some comes at the expense of others, and demonstrates how when people work together across racial lines, we can achieve what she calls the solidarity dividend. Today, we're focused on chapter 7 of The Sum of Us, which is about where we live and go to school. I would like to start off by thinking about who lived here before us and acknowledge that we stand on the traditional territory of the Lenape people. I'd also like to remember Charlotte, who was born in Larchmont in 1814. Charlotte and her mother, Nellie, were enslaved persons owned by Peter J. Monroe, the original resident of the Manor House located around the corner on 18 Elm Street. We are joined here by Maria Dautruche, and we're hopeful to welcome Matt Gonzalez. They're both amazing individuals. Let me introduce you to Maria first. Maria Dautruche is a Black woman, friend, mom, and wife. Professionally, Maria is director of the YWCA White Plains and Central Westchester Center for Racial Equity and project manager of Race Forward's H.E.A.L Together initiative. Maria is also a trained RX for Racial Healing Circle facilitator. Before taking on these roles, Maria was a senior advisor to the president and CEO of the National Urban League. Maria co-founded New Voices for Reproductive Justice, a powerful organizing force for the health and well-being of Black women and girls, women of color, and LGBTQ+ people of color at the local, state, and national levels. Maria is a member of the Westchester Black Women's Political Caucus Mount Vernon chapter and is proud to be from Mount Vernon, New York. So we'll start off with approximately a 60-minute, maybe 40, maybe since it's the two of us, maybe a 30 to 45-minute panel discussion, followed by Q&A. And I'd like to start off with the way that McGhee opens the chapter. She says, who your neighbors, your coworkers, and your classmates are is one of the most powerful determinants of your path in life. She begins by recalling the racial makeup of the spaces she has occupied, from schools to neighborhoods to workplaces. So I thought we could start by sharing the places that we found ourselves in and how they've shaped who we are today.
Thank you, and thank you so much, CURE, for the invitation. Want to make sure that I can be heard here in this room, but also to our participants joining virtually. More and more every day, especially now that I work in Westchester County and the way that I work in Westchester County, being from here, I recognize how deeply influenced I am from being from Mount Vernon. At the time, I was from Mount Vernon. I grew up in a city that remains predominantly Black in its racial demographic, with Black leadership, with Black activism and organizing to get fair representation on our school board so that the school board members reflected the student population and the families in the community. I was just surrounded by various ethnicities, all within a spectrum of Blackness. My parents are from Jamaica. There's a strong Caribbean influence, Black Caribbean influence in Mount Vernon. And I also grew up at Grace Baptist Church in Mount Vernon, which introduced me to various socioeconomic experiences within Black communities. And so my worldview at a very young age was not in any way limited or restricted by the idea that I was different from another person by virtue of skin color. And then in third grade, I switched schools. My parents put me in a parochial school in Tuckahoe. And in many ways, upon reflection, I was not ready for that environment. And in many ways, upon reflection, that environment was not ready for me. I think that there were a lot of assumptions that well-meaning educators and parents had that were informed by mental models and media narratives about who Black families are and how Black students should be accommodated in the classroom. And specifically, I would say to that, there's this idea of like the challenge with low expectations. So I'm aware that I'm a very bright person, right? Like, and I've been aware of this since I was young. My parents encouraged me. I scored well on tests. I was very curious. And so I never thought for a minute that there was this less than scenario that I would have to navigate through. And for whatever reason, I feel like in reflection, I had some educators who just expected less from me and also knew less about the places I was from. I specifically remember a teacher, I looked her up recently so I could like acknowledge her, but she has recently passed and she's been a longtime educator. And I felt I had an amazing education. But I remember this experience in the classroom in social studies in about 5th grade, and we were playing a game. And the game was to get up on different sides of the classroom and to name a country. And I just mentioned my parents are from Jamaica, so I was ready. I was like, no one else is gonna say Jamaica. I'm gonna say Jamaica. I'm gonna win this game. I know a lot of countries. And to, date myself and give some context, I was in 5th grade in like 1992. And it came to my turn and I was ready. Like, I'd been listening to everyone else, so I didn't repeat anything on the second round because this is where I'm clear I'm winning this round and we're gonna go to the next round. And I say Jamaica. And my teacher, who at this point, she was not a young teacher, she'd been a long-time educator. She said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you're mistaken, class. This is a very important distinction. Jamaica is a colony, and I asked for countries. Jamaica is a colony of the United Kingdom." It's not factually, it's not. And at that time it had not been, it had gained independence in the 60s, right? Like, and I knew this, but I also grew up culturally where you don't argue with adults, especially adults in authority. Like just culturally, I was not gonna argue with her, but I knew she was wrong and I wanted to win the game and I knew I could win the game, but she made a rule that if you didn't name a country, you were out of the game. So I'm out of the game. And what I reflect on, the anger I have is that those 28 other kids in the class probably still think Jamaica's a colony, right? Like that's what angers me to this day is like, they're just not gonna ever get it, right? And she and I had many scenarios like that throughout my time in that school. It was tough going the whole time, but I would say that what these two similar experiences taught me, being in this kind of little like Black bubble of love, and this diverse Black bubble of love, right? Like learning how to negotiate different social experiences, watching my parents do the work of assimilation, studying with my grandmother for her naturalization exam, and then going to this school where I was different, where here my differences were not a problem for anyone. And here they were so clearly like impacting other people's ways of like navigating me. And I mean, I'm like 8, you know, like, I don't know, like my daughter's 6, she doesn't like, I'm just a little kid and I'm trying to figure it out. And, you know, when I think about how that influences me, how it influenced me then and now, I recognize that one of the ways I have navigated being in all the spaces I've been in is, which I'm learning to unlearn and have better practices for, is I just found it easier to be in space with white people when I pretended to be dumb and deferential. I just assumed that's what you all wanted. And you know what? It kind of worked. My career accelerated. No, you know, no one's offended. I'm just, oh, you must be so, I must have misunderstood the question about colony versus country. Okay. And just let you have it. Because I also learned in other instances as I got older that there tended to be, hello, Matt. There tended to be, so now I can like make my answers briefer. Thank you so much. It's a good discipline for me to learn, just wrap it up, which I will now. And so when I think about how things impact me, and I think what is clear in the book is that harms everybody, I don't even think white people think about what they're missing out on because of the power structures they've set up. 28 kids that day did not leave a firm that Jamaica, Barbados, Bermuda, Antigua, the entire, there were no Caribbean colonies in 1992, unless you want to get into a conversation about Puerto Rico as a Commonwealth, which she also did not make space for, right? So, you know, it's just, everyone's missing out. And to be in a space with your coworkers, with people in your neighborhood, and to know that they're diminishing themselves with you because they assume this is easier for you. And we all know what happens when white folk feel uncomfortable. You know, I don't like you telling me what to do, I'm calling the cops. Well, you know what, have it. You want to do your thing, do your thing. You know, so I think that when you think about how I am impacted by it is, for years, I diminished myself in that company and would therefore come into spaces with my own community and really rely on that for confidence, really rely on it for healing, really rely on it for refuge, really rely on it for love and support, almost to the point that in the same way a lot of well-meaning educators think less of their Black students, I have to confront the fact that I have lower expectations for the empathy and cultural container for discomfort of white people. I walk through the world assuming they can't handle it, and I don't want that fight today. I don't know if I have the capacity to hold them. It has been my experience. They can't handle it. I'll wait till I get home. And so, you know, when you hear reports that the group reporting the highest numbers of I don't want to go back to the office are people of color, they're tired of having to navigate that every day, plus do their job. So they're just kind of like, you know what, let me just stay here, camera optional, get my stuff done, leave me alone. And you miss out, because I know we're fun, more or less. And we have so much to offer, and so much of that is curbed. And there's a great deal of daily self-restriction that takes a lot of energy. This is a practice smile. God forbid I be seen as an angry Black woman. when anger is nothing but an appropriate response to injustice. And every day there's injustice. So yeah, I think that's how my neighborhood, my growing up, my experiences have shaped me. And to frame it that way, you know, is also an intentional thing for me right now because of the healing work I want to do for myself. To frame it as, oh, I'm walking around thinking y'all can't handle the fullness of my humanity. There are reasons why I think that, but that's what's happening. I'm assuming whenever I show up in the fullness of myself in this company, it's going to be really hard for them. And the difficulty they have working through that is going to be problems for me. So we're just never quite going to get there.
Wow, Maria, that was what a powerful story. And thank you for your honesty and sharing that with us.
Yeah, that'll be the longest response I'll get.
I want more of that. I love that. I was just like going to church with you.
So I'd like to welcome Matt Gonzales.
Yeah.
Matt, rather than launch into your formal introduction, maybe you could
Sure.
tell us about your incredible background and then tell us a bit how the spaces you've been have shaped who you are today.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Sorry. Apologies for my tardiness. CPT / just getting out of New York City. Sometimes, you know, it's a social construct. But so my name is Matt Gonzales. Use he, him pronouns. Live in New York City. I'm originally from Los Angeles. I grew up in a community called Inglewood, and actually, funny enough, which I'll talk about. I went to high school in a community in LA called Westchester, not unlike the Westchester of New York City, right? So I'll talk more about that. But so I grew up in Inglewood, which, if anyone, I don't watch football, but if you've watched football, you know that the Super Bowl just happened at the Forum in Inglewood, which is my hometown. I say that because it's kind of a painful thing to think about that. You know, that's a community that my family was priced out of like 20 years ago, right? And so it was a historically white community because of various, you know, mechanisms of historic segregation. It then became a historically Black and Latino community, Black and Mexican in particular, which is kind of the time I grew up there. And at this point has become, you know, it's kind of facing the wave of gentrification because of the Forum, because of you know, I went to a desegregated high school because of some of my white friends who were moving into my neighborhood that they wouldn't actually come visit to me in high school, right? So I grew up in Inglewood, which was a predominantly Black and Latinx community. Went to school there K through 8. So I experienced, you know, what I would articulate as like a completely intentionally divested educational system. One that, you know, again, there was a very clear function of white flight out of my neighborhood, which is part of the legacy and history of segregation in this country. And so I know for a fact that the opportunities and resources that were poured into my community were certainly not proportionate to our need, nor were they, you know, proportionate to those that were kind of offered up to surrounding communities. In high school, we moved out because really we couldn't afford to live there anymore. And I think I remember my dad was just at a school that was across the street from us, like a performing arts high school, which is, I wish I would have went there, but they were full. And I remember my pops just like talking with the folks in the office, and they said, "Oh, how about Westchester High?" And I was like, "Where the fuck is Westchester High?" Pardon my French. But where's Westchester High, right? And it was 10 miles away, an hour and a half away from me on the bus, because I wasn't driving at that point. And so my dad had heard of Westchester High because we sent folks to the MBA, you know, out of our class. And so he recognized the school as being a good school, supposedly, right? It was a 90% Black and brown school in a neighborhood that is 90% white. I had friends who would be like, oh, like looking at their the deeds on their houses and like literal restrictive covenants saying no Blacks, no Jews, no Mexicans can purchase these pieces of properties. They would hold these up like it was some sort of like emblem of like it was always wild to me. So that was my growing up experience. Was, you know, I got to attend a desegregated high school. I have a rainbow of friends, right? A really diverse group of friends economically, you know, just culturally, you know, ethnically in so many ways. And like, I'm proud of that. I'm still really tight with a lot of my high school friends. But also, you know, I had to drive through a white neighborhood, you know, every day to get to school once I started driving, right? And got pulled over regularly with, you know, with the car full of Black and brown kids trying to get to access our right to a public education, right? So I had a tremendous amount of benefits culturally, my identity, again, I never felt like it was a 90% kids that look like me. And so my identity was strong. Our sense of culture was strong. Access to resources was nice. Like the reason I think I have navigated into the places I'm in right now have a lot to do with the opportunities that were, afforded me at that school. But I also, would get, me and my friends would get criminalized more heavily. We'd get disciplined differently, right? We would also have entirely white AP classes because it was also a magnet school. And so a bunch of my white friends who we like hung out on the lawn, right? And during break and stuff, when we'd go to class, we'd be going to separate tracks, right? And so I didn't have a college counselor. I'm the first person to go to college in my family. There was a college counselor on campus. They were not there for us, right? There was also Army recruiters on campus who were there for us, right? And so understanding like, I advocate for integration. I was a teacher. I taught in segregated schools. I fight in New York City and across the country to desegregate and integrate our schools, and do a number of pieces of work locally, at the state level, nationally, really to build a more equitable education system for all of our young folks. For me, that really starts with centering Black and Brown communities and understanding the historical function of education was not to educate us. It was to strip us of our culture. It was to maintain and build a pipeline to uphold our capitalist system, right? And so I think for me, I work from the premise that that's the function of public education today and in the past. And so everything I'm doing here is actually about minimizing the damage and harm that system is going to do to our families and communities. And maybe this is just what's happened over the last couple of years. I like resonate so much with this sense of pessimism that I'm really trying to like strip from myself, right? Like I want to live in a place of hope. But for me, like that, and really coming back to what I'm hearing in the book so much is just like this hopefulness that white folks, like in these stories of white folks doing the right thing, right? And like conversations like this are right. For me, I'm like, if we're doing this one white person at a time, like we've been waiting hundreds of years and we're going to wait hundreds of more years. And so I struggle with the like work of like needing to convince white folks to do the right thing and then needing to like push Black and Brown people to enter spaces where we know we're going to be harmed and damaged. Again, while honoring and acknowledging that like to preserve and protect our democracy, we have to integrate our communities and like there's so many reasons beyond academic opportunities, resources, but just like for the function of our democracy, I actually believe we truly need desegregation and integration in our schools and our communities. I struggle in this moment to like, it's not a matter of like, waiting for folks to like come to the table. I'm done waiting for hearts and minds to be changed. We have to change public policy. People who are in power have decisions to be made and are not making them, right? And like, they're like, well, it's because people will leave schools, will leave communities. Those are, so I guess I'm just in a place where like, I really want to see active public policy and assertive efforts from those who have access to power. Because like, I love to read the like Ali Takada's story, in the chapter. I know Ali and I like just love to hear that beautiful like narrative, right? But I'm also like, if it takes, we have to wait for allies and other people across the country to do the right thing, we are never going to get there. And so I guess I come to this conversation in this moment of like some pessimism and trying to hold hope at the same time. That's so much because of all the work that I've gotten to do and like all the people I get to be with, like fill me with hope. I do a lot of youth and parent and educator organizing, and that keeps me like going. I'm just, it's just been hard to watch over the past couple of years when we like our government, our community should have really held us and they like didn't. And kids got to watch that. We got to see that. And so like the like radical failure that we've watched over the last couple of years is really the radical failure of the last 60, 50, 100 years of this country. And so I like was reading and I was actually audiobooking the book and finding some like really trying to find some hope in myself. And so, sorry, I'm bringing some like pessimism here, but I think it's like, it's where we're at, right? And so I'm trying to like live in that space. So I'll pause there.
Hope is a discipline, we know, right?
Right.
Hope is a discipline.
Absolutely.
And I've also heard, hope is a privilege because you can
Mm.
afford to wait while you're
Right.
hoping.
Right.
And not everyone has that privilege to be like, oh, I can wait for this. Like
Mm.
I felt an incredible like energy
I don't know if it's just because you're carrying a life, but when I was carrying my daughter, when I was pregnant, I was just like, oh, everything's going to change now. And I didn't know how, but I was like, everything. And I wasn't even thinking about me and like our little family scenario, but it's an intentional, like we deliberated, are we sending her to public school? Where will we suffer the most harm? Do we have the capacity as her parents to shore up the deficit she may encounter being a bright little Black girl in an independent school in Westchester? So can we give her the cultural competence?
Right.
Can we give her the confidence? Can we show up the way we're going to have to show up to fight that system for her to survive and thrive? Or do we say, okay, public school? And if we got to send her to Kumon, send her to Kumon. If we got to get a tutor, get a tutor. If we got to, take some time off of work and get in there and do it ourselves and join the PTA and advocate and our choice was public on purpose, deliberately, right? Like when you add up all the additional costs of everything else we're doing to like make it whole, yeah, we could have sent her to either the same school I went to or one that's ranked even better. But for what?
Well, just even having to like
navigate,
even have that conversation.
We had this conversation
right?
for like 2
my
years, and then
gosh.
she wasn't even like old enough, right? And then COVID hit, and I was like, I don't even know. I give up. And we had to pick a pre-K, and it was like, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the anger, the injustice there for me was not that I had to do it, but I was making the assumption white moms don't have to do this. And this is annoying.
As a white mom, let me just jump in because I hate to, just to contrast your experiences with mine. So I grew up in upstate New York, and there was one Black community, two Black families in my town that I could remember, and they stood out for me. That was Fenty's house, and that was the Jackson's house. And I had one Black friend in high school, and he got pulled over. The one time we were in a car, he was driving a car full of white kids and got pulled over. I went to an Ivy League university. I was with all white people. I went to graduate school in the UK, white people. When I would come home and say, oh, I met South Africans, people would think I'd met Black people, but no, I met white people. And then when I worked in investment banking and in the brokerage industry, right? So and when we came to move here, after our daughter was about 4, I didn't really think about where we were, about the racial composition of the place where we were moving. I wanted to move to a place where I knew that people may have some of my political values and where we wouldn't be the only Christians. It was like, was it going to be mostly Christian or mostly Jewish? Well, I wanted a place that had both. And it wasn't until I went to graduate school at Teachers College, where Matt was a colleague, co-ed with me.
Yeah.
He experienced it, I think, as a predominantly white institution, but I experienced it as my first real contact with people of color.
Our cohort was, so to this day, Columbia is a super white, rich institution. Our cohort, I think in particular, was one of the more diverse
and more
cohorts.
active.
Yeah, for sure.
And one day I walked into a classroom where I was the only white person. And what I experienced was what Maria talked about. These people were alive. Normally in class, they wouldn't speak. It was a class full of white people. People were relatively quiet. But in this classroom, it was full of just incredibly energetic, vibrant, brilliant, beautifully dressed people. And it really changed my life. It really is like switched something on for me. And I became much more interested in thinking about, well, how do I make my life here more like the life that I have when I'm in Teachers College? And that's sort of where I come to today. And I think that takes me to my second question, which is to note that McGhee says, white people are the most segregated people in America. And white people aren't used to thinking of where we live that way. And I gave everybody a redlining map, and that's the map of where we are right now. Just to show you this, the Larchmont is kind of over in the lower corner over here. And on the back, if you take a look, these maps were developed in the 1930s by the, what were they called? the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which assessed the riskiness of lending. And on the back, you can see there's a little area D14, which is right by where Route 95 gets off right now. You can tell where they put the highway, right? On the back, it describes the area, and it says low flat land, an area of cheaply constructed singles and doubles lacking any pride of ownership. Who lives there? 50 laborers and domestics, 50% Italians, Negro, yes, 50%. The trend of desirability is going downward. So this is like very real. We think of redlining, for example, as happening, I don't know, somewhere else, but it's really part of who we are today. And I just wondered, New York State is the most segregated state in the United States, which we don't blows people's minds.
I can't stop talking about it, but yeah.
It's got the most segregated schools in the United States for black and white children, second most for Latinx children, other than after California. And I wanted to ask you guys, how did this happen? I think I pointed out redlining, but what else do we need to know about how white people in particular got to be so segregated?
You want it to be. So that you willed it into existence.
But at the same time, we always say, well, New Rochelle is black or Mount Vernon is black because black people want to live together.
We were pushed together,
Right.
beloveds. We were also living kind of spread out and on our own terms on the continent of Africa, and we were pushed together into these ships and brought over here with disregard for our culture, language, experiences, or our ability to get along with one another. So I'll offer a quick how I think about racism, and then I'll toss it over to Matt, and then we can play this game. So I believe two fundamental things that, and they come from people who have taught me about racism. One is Dr. Gail Christopher, who trained me in the prescription for racial healing facilitator training I've received. Dr. Gail Christopher is amazing. Please look her up as there is time for you to do that. Racism robs us all of our humanity. That is really all I have time to, that is the definition she offers. I agree. And then that connects with another person I follow. I would call a teacher of mine. He refuses to be known as a guru, which I'm like, we're not gonna call you that. But a great teacher of mine as well, Resma Menachem, who says, I know, right, snaps to that. He's an amazing human who's just done this work for decades and is now kind of getting known more for it. So Resma says, here's the thing about racism. It's not about, I hate you. That's not the primary moving force. It's not, I'm white and I don't want to live near black people, or I'm black and I don't want to live near other white people because I hate you. Racism is about, it's a species question. It's about protecting a set of priorities and interests that require someone to be exploited. And how can we exploit another human? Well, we must now go into the process of dehumanizing them, right? So, this whole idea of, so let's get white people a little break. It's a lot. So how do you identify racially explicitly, right?
Right.
Okay, so we're not of the same race explicitly, right? So I don't know you, I don't hate you, but I'm not sure if you're like a human the way I'm a human. So if we live on the same block, and like my little girl starts to have little love feelings for your little boy, and they get together and we're in proximate, like, what's that baby gonna be? Like, and the royal family was like, how black is this baby really gonna be? That's the question. It's like, is it human enough to be close to me? Is it a monkey? Is it a dog? Can I lock it up? Can I put it in a cage at the border? Can I disappear it without any tangible impact on my humanity? And the answer is no, you cannot. You cannot brutalize entire groups of people and not also harm yourself. So back to the original definition, it robs us all of our humanity. So you have to, in my opinion, take the time to unpack, what are you losing when you choose to be the only group of human and the standard of humanity? You start to isolate. You look down, I know we're in Westchester, but you look down in the city and you say to yourself, oh, I love Central Park. It's so gorgeous. Let's play. That used to be Seneca Village. It used to be a place Black people owned their land and lived on. And they were given this land, not because it's so nice to give the happy Negroes land that they can thrive and flourish, because white folk living in lower Manhattan near the port, near the central place of commerce, were like, we've already decided these indigenous people are not human. So we're gonna need a buffer. And it's gonna be you Black people, so that if they ever wanna fight, they're gonna fight you first, and we have time to watch the fight and protect ourselves and fight back. We're not gonna like join you in the fight, but we're gonna be prepared. And there was never any of these fights. It was just this made up thing that everyone who's not us is violent, that everyone who's not us is less civil. These words, like, what is a good neighborhood? What is a good school? That's the question Heather's asking, right? Like, how did white folk become so segregated? Y'all made a decision, maybe not in this generation, but generations back, that you have benefited from and complicitly agreed to generation after generation, that y'all were good. And everything else was less than that standard, and therefore was subject to challenge and question and pushing away and exclusion. And I've got to protect this good. And like, I didn't make this up. Y'all can read the 1993 Harvard Law Review. Y'all can look at Jane Elliott's studies. To this day, white people have not come up with, at what cost would you give up this privilege? Whiteness as property. You've codified it and you're protecting it. And every time we get close to being like, hey, we're all human, Black lives matter too, all of the lives matter. Well, all of whose lives? If it is true that all the lives matter, and I, a Black person, explicitly state, great, so my life matters. And you go back to the original conversation, it's like, well, is my life not, like, what are we talking about? All
answers matter.
All answers matter. All cancers matter. All of them, all the time. And it's like, it's exhausting to have to like keep unpacking this, because you've created systems that protect themselves very, very well. They're like multi-headed beasts. And the minute we lop one head off, it regenerates smarter, faster. Like, we didn't have to deal with like digital racism and like algorithmic. I didn't have to deal with this before. Now I gotta learn code so I can get a job. It's too much. So, I mean, not to get the job, but to like, you know, have you ever been like in an AI, like, so a lot of people in the pandemic were trying to like take their LSATs. And so they set up this thing where it's like, well, we have to know it's you, so you're not cheating. So can you imagine taking your LSATs with this huge megawatt bulb in your face so that the camera recognizes you as a person because it doesn't pick up certain colors? Who has the time? I'm taking the LSATs. Give me a break. But those are the systems, and it's built into every system. And so the pessimism is real. It's like, this is created to exhaust us. Right. You've created systems to just wipe us out. We like, who has it, right? Who has the?
Well, I mean, I think that's like you get to the with the ideological like underpinning of like why, right? And then you like, okay, well then this is like the belief system, right? And we're gonna like, what can we create in terms of institutions around housing policy, around steering where people live, right? And then what can we also like, there's so many layers of institutional structures built up to uphold that sense of ideological
and
like superior. Too. Oh, right. It's so that I'm just like, I was just doing a training last week with a bunch of mostly white teachers, and we were like, you know, when was the first time you like were conscious of your racial identity, right? Most of these folks 30s, 40s today, right? Like, and I was like, oh, cool. When I was like 7 and some girl was like, your skin looks like dirt. And I was like, do you understand? And I'm like, okay, like I didn't even understand at that point, like that was a harmful thing to say, right? I was a kid. And like the girl may not have even been saying it in a harmful way, but just the idea that like at that point I had to go home and ask my parents like what that meant. And they had to explain to me what like racism as a child, right? So like there's a interpersonal ways that these things manifest for us that we're trying to navigate throughout a day-to-day process, right? And then you're like, okay, well, let me also try to buy a house. And the one way that we create generational wealth in this country is through property, right? Like that's the process we've created in this country. And like you've created an entire whole system and a legacy that it still exists today, right? Like there is informal ways that we are still upholding restrictive covenants. We are upholding like exclusionary zoning and other so there's a whole policy infrastructure built up to uphold these ideas, right? These narratives, these premises that folks live by. And then, I mean, I think what McGhee said was so fascinating. Like you know, I was like writing a Twitter thread this morning that didn't make any sense. It was just like quotes from the book that I thought were dope, like, or alarming, right? Like since LBJ, right, over 60 years, and since LBJ invested in like a so-called civil rights agenda for the Democrats, although I don't know about the current Democrats' civil rights credentials, but like since LBJ made that a priority, the Democrats have never won a majority of white people, right? And so there's an investment that Maria is talking about, right? There's been an investment, a political investment, an economic investment, an educational investment, residential housing investment. There's many investments. So an article worth reading is George Lipshitz's The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, right? And this idea that whiteness is a thing, right? Is a tangible thing, right? It actually holds currency. And so I think that's the thing that like I'm like hearing so heavily in McGhee's book is just like, what is the current, like what is the threshold, right, at which you will give up that currency? Because like actually the point I think that she's making is that like that's a short-term payment or short-term like benefit you're going to get for a much longer term deficit that now you have when you have a ransacking of a Capitol, or you have people who are like so completely disconnected from others like them that they believe, you know, a Black president was born in Kenya, which is nothing wrong with that, right? But like, they're just like these wild ideas and fantasies can be constructed when you've never met anyone, right? When 75% of white people only live around white people, right? Or white people like are going, or the majority of white people are living in communities that are 75% white.
Which is what we live in now.
Right.
The
No,
town-
I know this, right? I drove through this neighborhood and I was like, it's hard to get to this library, right? Like, how do you get to this library on a bus? And maybe I just don't know because I don't know the neighborhood, but
Boston bus, it's cool.
okay.
But
I was just
Boston
like,
Post-
I was like dipping through these hoods. I'm like, I gotta like, it's fascinating to drive through the neighborhood. It's beautiful, right? And it looks dramatically, fantastically different from my neighborhood, New York City.
For me, it's the toll on 95. That's my cutoff. I was like, I get to exit like coming up north. If I'm past exit 16, I'm like, oh, I'm missing my exit. I'm about to pay a little $1 toll for this. I mean, and if you know the area, you know, you can get off and just take whatever. But if you don't know it, you know, when I invite friends up, meet me at Playland or and then I have to tell, get off at 16 if you want to, or you could just stay, it's like $1, whatever, pay it. But like, that's a line, right? Now, I don't really know the actual history of how that toll and that line came to be, but it's a signifier to me. And it's been my whole life. Same way that 3rd Street Bridge they just redid connecting Mount Vernon to Pelham, that's a line for me. Like if I'm closer in my growing up to Mount Vernon because I'm near the Memorial Field, which is this big thing Mount Vernon's been trying to rebuild for years. They're gonna get it together. Let's not focus on the past. But you know, I'm closer to the line. I'm closer to where Pelham is. So Pelham Public Library is a closer library to me than Mount Vernon Public Library. Pelham High School is a closer high school to me than Mount Vernon Public High School. But I never felt like, though they are public, and though this municipal line is really just a made up thing, that I could access it, that I could feel welcome there. Now, my mom, who just doesn't care, like she came here from this country, she's like, I paid my dues, I've taken the test, we're going wherever it's comfortable for me. You know, she'll take my daughter to Pelham Public Library for toddler time whenever it's convenient. She's like, oh, I'm here. The library card works everywhere. We're good. But I remember she asked Pelham, the village of Pelham, you know, oh, our daughter wants to go to high school. This is right here. How do we go about figuring that out? We live in Mount Vernon. And they're like, oh, that'll be $5,000. Now, on the principle of we're not paying to go to public school, I went to Catholic school. And I think that's something to figure out too, the way our schools are funded through the tax base and municipal codes and all of these are the systems and how they talk to each other or how they choose not to talk to each other when it would be beneficial to us. It's like, well, you have to call this other department. And it's like, okay, I guess I will spend another 7 hours waiting. But that I think it's intentional and it's deliberate. And I think what is fueling the pessimism is that when you know the issue is not a dysfunctional system, it gets harder and harder to keep trying to reform because it's not dysfunctional. It is functioning exactly as designed. So like me arguing with the system feels like maybe not the best investment of my time. So what else can I do? that still gets me the end result.
Well, I mean,
It's
I think
hard.
that's I think where I was like, this is not designed to like, I'm like, I do all my work is primarily in education. So I'm like this is a system that should be loving and caring for our babies, and they're not, right? And so I'm like, is this system ever going to do that? And I'm just like, no, it's not, right? There's nothing we can do, no policy we can write that's going to correct that, because that is baked into how we have decided our public education system has to operate, right? For me, it's like, how do I minimize the damage that this system causes to our communities, right? And like that's such a like a pessimistic place to be too, right? It's like, I work in a place and then so like my pay time, you know, is like trying to minimize damage. Anytime I have outside of that is like trying to like imagine a better future with people, because like we actually can do that. Like systems of care and support and love for Black and brown folks absolutely exist already, right? It's actually, they don't get invested in, they don't get honored or valued. And anytime something starts to happen, like let's destroy that thing, right? Like, or let's try to co-opt it, right? And so for me, it's like I hold the pessimism and the radical hope, because I think they need to exist. They kind of got to coexist. But you know, again, for me, I'm like on the day to day, it's like I ain't here to change the system anymore. I'm here to like stop it from killing us, right? And like and that I'm struggling with that, right? I'm like, should I just go work on Wall Street and make $1 million and then just try to forget about all this stuff? Because like,
There's enough of us doing that already.
someone needs to just give me some of that money.
So you guys, McGhee says integration benefits all people. I'm getting the feeling that it's a more complicated story than that, at least in your minds. But I could be wrong. So I'm interested in your take on that.
I don't think you're wrong. I think the underlying assumption is that like, the thing about integration that's so fast is like the underlying assumption is that like, we want to be with y'all. Like we all want to just bum rush Larchmont and live here. I do not.
I like my neighborhood.
I'm good. If I could, if somebody would give me a reparations check and I could fix this tax system, I would just live in Mount Vernon for the rest of my life. I love Mount Vernon. Before I had my current positions, you read in the bio, I worked at the National Urban League, centuries old civil rights organization. And the deep respect I have for my former boss, Mark Morial, who shared a story with me about when he wanted to go to college and how his parents had been denied this access to integration. And they felt so strongly, you have to go to Penn. You have to go to the University of Pennsylvania. Like, this is where you have to go. We couldn't go. You get to go. You have to go. Like, we fought so hard for you to go. You have to go. And you go and you're just harmed, right? I mean, he did well. He's like an amazing human, but he wanted to go somewhere else that he just didn't have the space to explore. And I think there is this, for me, I don't want to speak for all Black people. That's another thing that happens when there's not a lot of Black people around. One person comes around and like, we represent everybody. And it's like, I'm not the representation of the LoBue Guild. Like, I'm just myself. But you know, there's this, it's a weight, you know, I'm carrying this weight of connection and obligation and accountability to those who came before me and really did bust these doors open, right? Because the strategy was bust the doors open. There were some people doing some building in some other ways, and there were some people with the radical imagination. We could do our own thing out of necessity, out of desire, like invest in these historically Black colleges and universities. They are amazing places. But there's also this, like, we fought really, really hard for you to have a right to go to places we couldn't go to. We expect you to explore that experience fully. And not all of us want to. It's like, you know, I think of pipeline programs a lot. You know, we're gonna like train 1,000 underrepresented members of this community how to like be really good at tech jobs. And nobody's at Amazon or Netflix or Google or anything teaching them how to be a more inclusive workplace. So why do I need all this training? Why, when I'm a Black entrepreneur, I get into this, you know, accelerator program where I have to show up and learn about social media and marketing, and you know, this white guy in his garage just got $2 billion in venture funding. He doesn't know what he's doing. Have you watched the WeWork documentary? Y'all are hilarious. This is funny. Like, what are you doing? You just have this money to spend on these harebrained schemes that are not working. Like, Peloton, what is happening with these companies? And so, and yet you can't get, you know, Black businesses in this county or across this country eligible for PPP loans because they were operating amazingly, but not with, you know, staff members that needed to be held together, right? So even that system of how did that work? The PPP loan system, we need to investigate that. So that's somebody's thesis. You're welcome. But, you know, I think about, would I choose to push for more integration in spaces? I think the only space I am truly interested, like really in my imagination, in my heart, in my soul, really interested in integration is in our houses of worship. There is no other place that I feel it is personally worth my time right now. And even that would be a struggle, let's be honest, because, you know, some people have expectations. I like a little 3-point alliteration, organ solo, you know, but you know, people have different ways of going. So, but we're not, you have to be honest about readiness for that. Because this is what it's in the book. White people say, I want to live in these diverse communities. And then they just don't do it. And I think it's a readiness. It's a comfort. I want to be with people like me. I don't want to be the only one. Oh, I know what that feels like. I also would like to not be the only one. Let's build on that commonality. Where does it come from? What are we losing when we're having to hold that discomfort? And, you know, I think that's a real thing to have real community conversations about. What does integration look like? Integration is not a diversity question. It's an inclusion question. You got to do a little work. You got to build a culture of inclusion, right? You have to have some equitable practices. You have to have some community agreements for how we will be together. It's not just let's throw a party and have red balloons and white balloons and then they all fly away and we have no balloons, right? It's like, well, what are we really trying to achieve in integration? What does that mean? What does it mean because all it meant in our history was I'm gonna bust these kids to some other community and hope it works out. Call the National Guard if it doesn't. Right? The answer to it is militarization. Right. It's another system. But yeah, I don't know.
No, I'm loving it. Please. Well, yeah. So I think, I mean, I agree like with everything you said, right? You know, again, someone who I don't actually say that I went to an integrated school because I think, as Maria like really said, you know, it's not about proximity, right? Like for me, if there's this conversation, at least in some integration spaces, that is really about proximity to whiteness, and I reject that, right? Like, I live in a predominantly, I don't know, my community is probably fairly diverse, but grew up in, you know, a Black and brown neighborhood, and again, without, like, we had such a beautiful sense of community and identity and shared humanity together, right? And so, like, there's something really rich and beautiful about that. So, you know, for me, you know, I separate, when I try to talk about integration, I really separate these two ideas between desegregation and integration. So again, I went to a school that was desegregated. They broke down a system of like maintenance and separation, right? And allowed different kids to be together. All the discipline stuff, the getting pulled over. Like for me, integration is about like the inclusion. Like, how do you actually co-create a space that honors, values, and loves all young people and does it through an anti-racist lens? And so my work, you know, in schools in particular is like, if we're just trying to smash kids together and be like, peace, you got it, right? Like, we're gonna commit harm and damage for all the historical and like institutional reasons we've just talked about, right? And so, like, you know, when we're talking about integration, I think we have to be very intentional about what we mean. Like, let's break down systems of concentration and opportunity hoarding and like dismantle those systems of like resource hoarding, right? Like, I firmly believe that should always be part of our public policy platform. Like, simultaneously, we also need to be preparing and supporting like the creation of inclusive spaces, right? That could be in housing spaces, that could be in education. I work with a youth organization called Integrate NYC. We've spent the last 6-7 years constructing a framework called the 5 R's, which takes this into account, right? It's like an understanding that there's, you know, this is not just about race and enrollment policy. It's also about resource distribution. Segregation is also about the relationships we create inside of our schools, right? Like, if we're not doing the work to bring kids together, to train teachers to teach from a culturally responsive and anti-racist lens, they're going to reinforce and replicate systems and ideas of separation that permeate all of our schools, right? If we're not dismantling the school to prison pipeline by eliminating punitive discipline policies that we already know disproportionately target and like harm and criminalize Black and brown bodies, right? Then we're not actually doing the integration work. We're just doing the deseg work. And so for me, we got to do that stuff together. And if we're not doing that together, and if we're pushing an agenda that is just about bringing people together without, you know, I always tell the students I work with, this is not about, you know, moving bodies, it's about moving resources, like opportunity and power, right? Because that's what integration needs to be about. And so if we're doing it from that framework, I support it, right? And I want, you know, and obviously, again, I'm a big supporter of integration. But if we're not doing that, and I think it's so much of what we've seen in this country, you know, I think of two things. My friend Natasha in New York City, who's an amazing organizer, and like I get to work with them on a day-to-day basis, and they just bring joy to my life, right? They also told me that like I went to, you know, they're like, my uncle went to an integrated school. He's got a great job now, but he also used to get chased out of the neighborhood with rocks, right? And I'm like, cool, that's not integration. And then I also think of Dr. King's quotes, right? Like, you know, in his more kind of moving, you know, towards pessimism, this idea that he said, you know, I fear that I'm integrating my people into a burning house, right? Like, and like the house has been burning, the house is burnt. And so, right, all right, that's so for me, like, what are like maybe we just gotta let this thing burn down, right? So that we can like all collectively build something together, because like the like white folks are going to always maintain like work to keep whatever little structure, as shoddy as it is, it's theirs, right? And we can't get some. So they're going to work to maintain that burning building at the expense of burning the identities and the cultural dexterity and opportunities of their own kids, right? So their kids are going to go to college and be like, well, I got to write an op-ed to the New York Times because I can't say racist stuff, right? Because I'm getting canceled, or I'm self-canceling, right? And so this whole thing where we've constructed this like really false sense of identity, of merit, of being more deserving than others, like that harms white folks in ways that like we're seeing generationally. And again, I think it's eroding our democracy. It has eroded our democracy in like profound and scary ways that like the insurrection for me is like such a function and a long-term manifestation of segregation and separation, and this idea of like no accountability for white privilege and power.
So thank you both for, I mean, for such, you know, anyway, we can take this up again. I want to keep talking. So, but it's time to open up the conversation for questions.
The question is, can you tell us a little about his background? Just because she gave an introduction.
Oh, sorry, no, I jumped in.
I was just curious.
Sure, I'll be quick. Yeah, so I grew up in Los Angeles. I've been working in education almost 20 years. Gosh, I'm feeling old now. But so I grew up in Los Angeles. I attended segregated schools there. I also attended a desegregated school. I taught in segregated schools. I was a former middle school teacher, math teacher, before moving to New York. Came to New York and met Anne and studied public policy, education policy at Teachers College. I got there and I, you know, shout out to Nicole Hannah-Jones, you know, I was walking home from class one of these days and I was listening to the This American Life episode, The Problem We All Live With. It's a two-parter, beautiful, and was in tears because of the stories that she elevated. And then I just started like, you know, finding everything that she wrote, everything that I ended up writing, thinking about, researching, reflecting on, and trying to organize around became focused on segregation, and then just even understanding my own story and experience of segregation. So for the last, I was supposed to go back to LA like 7 years ago, and that was, you know, so I've been here. So for the last 8 years, really been working. I work at NYU, I work at the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. I'm the director of the Education, Justice, Research, and Organizing Collaborative, EJ-ROC for short, it's a mouthful. So I oversee all of our education, justice, policy, community organizing, and like a little research work, but I'm not a researcher. And so I work with community-based organizations fighting for education justice. I support a number of coalitions locally and nationally. And I'm a steering committee member of the National Coalition on School Diversity and sit on a bunch of advisory boards doing too much on a day-to-day. But am here on a regular day basis to like dismantle white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy and police.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, do we have, I know we might have, do we have questions in the room or anything on Zoom?
I'm sorry, Anne, it's not you.
Okay. Yeah, and comments are welcome too. Nicole, we have a question.
I'm gonna really get my workout today.
Get those steps in.
Hi, thanks for sharing your experiences and your ideas. Actually, there's a lot of questions I wanted to ask. Maybe if no one else asks, I'll ask all. But so I grew up in Mamaroneck, which some people don't know is actually all of Larchmont. And I went to the Mamaroneck Avenue School, which is the one of the 4 elementary schools in the district. It's actually the it's more segregated than the other schools. But when I went there, it was actually 20% Black, and it's actually now about 4 or 5% Black, but it's about 50% Latino. So there's been a lot of interesting changes happening over the last 20 years in Mamaroneck, Larchmont overall, as well as the country. But anyways, there's been a lot of kind of things going on with movement of white people and not wanting to move into that district. And I was hoping, because in chapter 7, there was a lot of talk about, policies, with redlining and just with homes and with education, district lines. I was wondering if it seemed like you guys were very pessimistic with changing policies to try to combat segregation. But I actually was hoping to hear more about some ideas that we could use to combat segregation, because I do see a lot of it still in Larchmont Mamaroneck School District and the real estate as well. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have any ideas, on policies, because actually, I don't know if I guess there's an interesting thing that Mamaroneck started doing in the school district in 2013 called Dos Caminos. It's a dual language program, and it's sort of billed as this sort of diversity, good for the the English language learner population, who are also mostly free lunch qualified students. But basically, the way it's functioning is it kind of acts as a draw for overcrowding at the 2 white school districts, Chatsworth and Murray, to kind of deal with their overcrowding, because everyone wants to live there if they're rich and white, instead of living in the other district. But then what happens is they'll be integrating the school Mamaroneck Avenue, but they actually created basically a separate school where they're not interacting much with the other students. And so I don't know, there's a weird stuff going on. I was hoping just to hear some ideas you had with what communities can do to kind of
That sounds like your jam.
segregation. Also, what's weird is
housing
the Hispanic population in Mamaroneck, a lot of them are immigrants, many undocumented. They can't vote to be part of the school board, so they have almost no say. It's actually in some ways, it's worse for when there was a larger Black population in the district, because at least then, if they were citizens, they had a say. So it's a lot of stuff going on. I was hoping, if anyone here also has ideas, I'd love to hear about it.
Sure. Well, thanks for that question. Yeah. So, there's, I think, decades of policy. So first of all, on the housing front, actually, I would just argue, now again, I'm not a housing expert, but I've learned from folks that I work with in housing spaces is actually just enforcing fair housing laws, which are not actually being enforced in any meaningful way. So just the enforcement of fair housing laws would actually help address some of the residential segregation. I don't know specifically the policy structures and some of the debates. I do know there's a lot of exclusionary zoning laws in this area. Again, there's a bunch of policies we can throw on the table. We'll write a list out for you. It's the political will to make changes is the pessimism I'm having, right? I live in the public policy world. So on the housing side, enforce the existing fair housing laws, start looking at what McGhee articulates very clearly as exclusionary policies that uphold and reinforce patterns and legacies of segregation. On the education front, we just passed a law in New York City that allows undocumented folks to vote. It is a totally possible thing to do. So do that, right? Start making sure that people who don't have a voice in the democracy have a voice in the democracy. On the school front, again, there are public policies that steer like people's decision making, and you all have to confront, like, you know, what are we demanding of our school board, right? Like, are we looking at concentrations of privilege and vulnerability as they manifest in our communities? Are we saying, like, again, and you know, without knowing the specific mechanics of like the educational segregation, it's very clear, like, you can set aside priority admissions, you can do active recruitment, you can set caps at like what the level of privilege looks like in a school. Again, you can do all this race neutral, you can do this, some of this race explicit if you do it, you know, strategically and with some care. So I think all those things, there's, again, public policies on the table. I would say for a group like this, y'all need to start organizing with Black and brown folks who are fighting for justice, right? Like, that's actually, like, y'all need to join the work that is being led by Black and brown people and get into those fights, right? Honor that work and then build trust. And then we can talk about, like, let's dismantle like legacies of segregation, right? Like we're talking about dismantling hundreds of years of public policy, priorities, infrastructure, you know, investments. And so, you know, I think it's, you know, there's multiple fronts to fight on, right? The public policy one is there. Let's talk about laying out an agenda, but I think that agenda needs to actually be directly informed by Black and brown folks who are directly, you know, more disproportionately negatively impacted. Again, right, trying to acknowledge that white folks are harmed by segregation, but the strategic, like, you know, destruction of our communities is happening. And so I would say, you know, those are various layers. And again, happy to, like, you know, point towards public policy. You can go ahead and read. Sorry.
I mean, I love public policy. I do.
Me too.
And I love public policy because it is designed and implemented and affects people. Right? Like, we like to talk about these things like they're not ours, like they're not extensions of us. Oh, let's fix the policy. Someone had to have written it. Mm-hmm. Some ones had to have voted on it, and some other ones will be responsible for implementing it. Who are those people? Right? Because that's gonna make a difference. So anyway, I'm a big fan of public policy. Go ahead and write some up, vote on it, make it real. And then I also think specifically to some of the things you were bringing up, connected to the organizing, which is super cool. Here's the thing about organizing in this moment. There's a long history of education justice movement, really led and like brilliantly laid out by Black and brown folk who's been just fighting for a right to be educated since they got here, right? Like, yes, we'd love to go to school and learn things. We're bright. What's going on? Let's do it. So I think there's a way to learn from that. You know, my favorite thing about our 45th president becoming president was all the white people who started listening and learning. It was amazing. I was like, oh, great. They're committed to this. Like, they're still saying it's years later. He's not even president anymore. They're still listening and learning. And I'm kind of like, so what have you learned? Like, who are you listening to? Like, where are we now? Like, is it fair to do an assessment now? It's been a couple of years. In my job, every grant report comes due 12 months. Have I solved racism? Working on it. So I don't know. We can check in about where we are with the listening and learning, but I think it's also following the lead of and being clear who you're following the lead of. There are, though they cannot vote, I feel pretty safe in my understanding of how communities work. There are probably undocumented parents organized already for what they need in their schools for their kids. And if they are fighting by themselves, that is part of the problem. Now, they're not going to come out and look for you because there are lots of reasons they should be hiding. And there's a lot of reasons they shouldn't trust you. But just in your own thinking, just check in. Am I assuming that's not happening? Do I have to show up and be a voice for the voiceless? Or should I show up with a mic that I can pass to someone who's not been listened to? How can I add support in a substantial way, following the lead of what these people say they need? So if they can't vote and they say to you, well, you need to vote on this stuff, you now have a task. Do it. Get 5 friends with you, right? Like, we know local turnout isn't always great. Like, take some buddies and go vote for these things that these people say they need. Stand up school board members and consider running for school board to support and advocate for those things. Like, this is not like an impossible list of options. It's all out there. And then I would also plug shamelessly that the organization Matt works for and the organization I work for, they're partners.
Yeah.
Even though this is our first time meeting.
Our colleagues are.
Our colleagues are working together. And so I would encourage you specifically on the school district level work to check out healtogether.org, literally spelled how it sounds, heal as in heel, not shoe, but like HEAL, H.E.A.L, together.org. That's a partnership with Race Forward, NYU Metro Center, Shot Foundation for Public Education, and a host of others nationally that are trying to get these multiracial local groups coming together to organize for this very work, like for integrated schools. One of our advisory board members for the Heal Together initiative is Heather McGhee, right? So we're taking these like lifting up the solidarity dividend and saying this is not a zero-sum game. That zero-sum game talk sounds a whole lot like binary thinking that white supremacy culture is really committed to. It's either this or that. Well, maybe it's a lot of stuff. Get in there and let's figure it out, right? So healtogether.org, I think get connected with that. We have an event launch at the end of this month. And as people sign up, we're able to connect them with folks by zip code. So you might meet a neighbor you know, you might meet a neighbor you don't know, but you'll figure out who else is committed to these values and principles and work in my community. And if it's, you know, hopefully we can get enough folks. I am pretty sure that come May 17th, which I think is our school board election dates around here, you'll find who the people are. Don't be confused or distracted by the manufactured chaos you are seeing at school board meetings. A lot of those people don't even live here, beloveds. They have been bussed in, highly coordinated and resourced work happening. But some of your neighbors are there and they're responding and they're fighting back. And so I think hooking up with that and figuring out how can I be useful in this space, given the outcomes I want to see. Given the fact that I want to see integration, I want to see desegregation, I want to see more inclusion. I want to live in a community where people have equal access to the opportunities that are their rights to have by virtue of real talk being humans, right? And then on the narrative side of things, I just want to be very clear about this. There's this narrative out there, and I don't want to assume people believe it, but I just want to say it because I don't know who's going to watch this, that when we say undocumented, we're thinking about some people who are some kind of cost center, that we're somehow carrying them, right? Like they're not working 4 jobs and paying taxes, right? So just to be like super explicit, when we talk about these people who are doing a number of jobs, not only cleaning our homes and caring for our families and working in hospitals, not like doing whatever they can, wherever they can to make a better life for themselves and their families, you know, that they are contributing to this community, not only by their labor, but also by their money. They're in the tax system with the rest of us. The system was designed to deny a vote, but not deny extraction of resources. So, you know, you can examine those things as well and figure out, just make sure that when you're talking about these communities, that you're telling the whole story about who these folks are. They're folks who are denied a vote, but who contribute pretty significantly, I think the research shows, and especially during this pandemic, as folks who have not stopped working and continue to be taxed, but have been excluded from a lot of the relief. You know, they're contributing real hard.
So we have time for a couple more questions.
Yes, we have a lady right here, and then we have someone online.
Thanks for the question, though.
I want to thank you.
We hear you.
We hear you. Make sure folks.
Okay. I want to thank you both for choosing to spend your afternoon with us. I have questions about the organizations that you're working with. Maria, I've heard about the Center for Equity, and I'm wondering, and I was late, so I apologize if you've already said this. If you could share what you see some of the priorities for Westchester that the center is working on. And I know them, Matt, I don't know if this is your part of, but I know Metro Center is doing some work, for example, in my school district and other school districts here in Westchester. And it's not going well from what I hear.
It's not mine, but it's my colleagues I've heard, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can speak to that, like what we can do in the communities to try to get back on track.
Gotcha.
You go first.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so without knowing, so Metro Center's a like 86 person, situation. There's like 9 units. I oversee one of them. we actually do school-based work around equity and bringing people together. I know my colleagues are currently in this space. We just had a conversation kind of referencing some of this. So yeah, what I would say is as Maria noted, right, there is a strategic effort, and it's so much of a voting strategy, and it's almost like Machiavellian genius, right? Like the way the Republicans just create a thing, and then it's a whole thing, right? So the anti-CRT, anti-diversity work that's well-funded and strategically being set across the country, that is permeating all across the country. It's happening in New York City, not in the more wild ways that it's happening, with people taking over school board meetings or threatening elected officials. So that I think that narrative, that energy is present, right? And
they're targeting diversifying suburban and rural areas.
Right.
So that's why we're seeing what we're seeing here
Mm-hmm.
as well. Westchester has become more diverse. We've seen it. You were mentioning it. We're one of the target places as a suburban and sometimes, kind of rural place.
Thank you. No, thanks for adding that. So I would say, again, without knowing the specific interpersonal interactions that are coming up, what we do know is that there is a strategic effort, a strategy to undermine any efforts towards diversity, equity, anything that honors Black and brown folks, right? So there is an effort to undermine that. I think what Maria said, what I was trying to say is what y'all can do in the district is show up to tell the leadership that you want diversity, you want equity, you want your kids to be learning about racial equity, racial justice, to be a counter voice. I think Maria can probably speak to some of the strategies you all are coming up with. I'm not in that mix all the time, but I think really there needs to be a counter narrative to the stop teaching, stop making my white kids feel bad. There needs to be a counter narrative to that. And then I think, going back to the first question, what are the public policy priorities you all are elevating, and what is the coalition building that's happening? So I think there needs to be expectations laid out by community members that we value diversity, equity, whatever the languages you all are using, we value that, we want that, bring it here, do more of it. And then, again, I believe that this doesn't work without young people, parents, educators in a directly coordinated effort to be young people need to demand an education that is truthful. Educators need to demand a working conditions that allow them to have free speech, right? Like that. Parents need to demand an education system that teaches their kids about history and the reality of this country and teaches them to be anti-racist. I think if you coordinate some of that work, that, again, that's not going to stop the strategy that's well funded, right? But it is a counter narrative. I'll stop there because there's a lot to say.
No, that's great. Yeah, one thing you can do is just say, we don't have it here today to pull out of our pockets the way everybody else has gotten their marching orders, but we want to see an equity plan for this community and work together to create it. What is the equity plan? And then what are our non-negotiables for how it is resourced and implemented? We mess so much stuff up on the implementation. I mean, I think that's, you have these brilliant people working on policy and coming in to say, well, let's advance this policy. And then we kind of fall off on the implementation and resourcing. I think the only place in this country where we're very good about enforcement is law enforcement. Everywhere else, we're kind of falling apart. And even there, we can argue that, how does that work? So we love to invest in it though. At the Center for the Westchester Center for Racial Equity was launched at the YWCA, White Plains and Central Westchester. So yes, I'll connect the dots. I have 2 whole jobs. Immigrants getting the job done. So, and that center, it was really built to have these 5 pillars of work around, having public programs, doing some training, being a thought leader in this space, a whole vast array of things that you can find on the YWCA's website, the White Plains website. The thing that I am really, I think, good at, and what I bring as the director to the center, is I'm really committed to racial healing. I think that the plans for the center make a lot of sense. The strategies make a lot of sense. I do not personally believe any of those things will be durable, sustainable, or effective unless we get this racial healing work done, which helps with the proximity, which helps with the whole, I get overwhelmed and then I can't do anything because I don't have a cultural container to hold this work. That helps with just racial bridging and intimacy, which you need if you're going to try to build inclusive cultures in your workplaces, in your schools, and in your communities. You need to figure that out. I mean, I'm looking at the audience. We got people of different generations here, but it's always interesting to me, like if we just did a quick show of hands, how many people grew up at dinner tables or family gatherings where the rules of engagement sounded a little like this? No politics, no religion, name another thing you can't look. I don't know. No politics, no religion. We're just here to have a good time. We're just here to get along. No politics, no religion. Don't talk about it. Anyone grow up in a house where you heard that? Or okay. No drama, no. So then what is our existence then? What are y'all talking about? Like the weather? Okay, cool. Like whatever you're doing in your
There's a
family,
lot to
cool.
say about the weather nowadays.
But now, but not climate change. I worked at the Smithsonian. We weren't allowed to say climate change. It was the human effect on the Anthropocene. Yes, let's intellectualize it. So I just feel like building those spaces where you're able to sit with the discomfort of some of that thing, unpack the grief that comes up with that. For some people, there's some guilt. I was complicit. I didn't know. I feel bad. You have to find spaces where you can build a temperament to handle the heaviness of the work. And so for me, that's now a key strategy at the Y, bringing people together into racial healing circles. And what I love about anti-racist racial healing circles is I don't force you all to come together and have folks of color sitting under white gaze and white folk, falling apart because they're like, I didn't know. And it's like, I know you didn't know. Go over here with all the other people who didn't know, and we're gonna get y'all together. And then those of us who had an inkling, we'll figure it out over here too. So racial affinity groups allow people to unpack things together in a way that allows for the spaciousness. I think in Westchester, because we see the problem of segregation, the solution is integrate. So bring everyone together immediately and it's all going to be okay. No, when you're going to the doctor and you're ill and the doctor's trying to figure out how we're going to solve this, he doesn't just give you the first medicine some salesman dropped off at the front desk. He asks your symptoms. You know what else he asks you? What other medication are you on? What other complex medical issues are you dealing with? I don't want to give you something that could help that would actually cause more harm. And a lot of times the whole, well, let's just get in a room and figure it out and decide on the policy. That's harmful. I mean, how many of you grew up with Black leadership? I did. Did you grew up with a Black teacher teaching you? Grew up with a Black pastor pastoring you? Grew up with a Black representative representing you, not because he looks like you, but because you're aligned on a set of values and an agenda. You're not used to following Black leadership. And things come up for you that you can't name. And then you're like, well, I just don't think that was a good fit. They didn't write down the plan the way I said to write down the plan. And so now the plan is bad. Or, or the tone, the tone policing. If you could just be nicer when you're talking to us, because we're all listening and learning and it's just a lot right now. Like, y'all got to get over that stuff. And for me, the work of the center is how do we work through that apart and then together? And without the gaze and the guilt tripping and the I don't want to say the wrong thing. A lot of being in community together is saying the wrong thing and figuring out how to be apologetic and then forgiving. And then to set a new norm together. That's actually really important to make the mistake, because the mistake reveals where you're really coming from. Let me give you some non-alcoholic wine and so you can tell the truth. It's really important to do that. So that's really the core work that I'm trying to structure now at the Y, to be able to have the capacity to not only train people who can facilitate their own racial healing circles, but offer racial healing circles through the Y to people in community. It's going to take a while. I wish I can say, everybody come, let's have a healing circle. But right now, we don't really have a lot of people trained. And I think there's a way to do it that's appropriate. That's not 100 people coming on a Zoom. Yep. The pandemic's been a bit of an issue, but we're working on ways to use our imagination to get people doing that. And Nicole has participated in a practice group when I was trying to pilot, how might I do this? So we have some tools and we have some theories of how we can move forward. But I would say, all the programs you see advertised, we're working with organizations. We do a lot of DEI things because people like DEI things. All of that, the core of it for me is making sure that it's centered on racial healing as a foundation for all that other work.
So I just want to sort of
Go ahead.
acknowledge that it's 3:30 and we said it would be 3:30. But if folks want to stay? We have a question. I think we have a question.
We
from
started
Zoom.
late. Can we just take one person from the outer world?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Hello, virtual questions.
Yes.
Are we
Okay,
gonna
we're
hear their
gonna
voice?
pipe a woman named Nancy in through.
Yeah, well, fancy.
Hi, you can hear me? Okay,
Barely,
good.
Nancy.
We're gonna bring up your volume.
Okay.
Oh, can you bring up your volume, Nancy?
Did I bring it up? Can you
Is
hear
that
me now?
possible?
I brought it up as loud as I could.
Okay, go ahead. We'll listen.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the sessions, but I'm a 65-year-old Black woman who grew up in New Rochelle. I went to Spelman College. I have a nice career and everything is groovy. But let me tell you something. When I talk to white people and they want to talk about racial equity, I tell them you need to talk to your white friends. Because I really think that white people need to talk to white people about getting together and what they need to do with regard to racism. Black people have spent over 100 years trying to have kumbaya conversations, and look where we are.
Thank you, Nancy. I think what I heard you
Okay,
say was that you, you're in New Rochelle, you
No,
had
I
a
don't
great-
live in New Rochelle. Right. You can't hear me, can you?
Okay, no,
The
I
panelists-
think you said white people need to talk to white people.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
that's
okay.
what they really, really do. And as
Agreed.
far as integration is concerned, we integrated, but the systems never integrated for Black people. The systems remained white. The systems remain controlled. I think that racism is a lot like a virus. And like a virus, its goal is to stay around. When I was a little kid, they used to say, oh, every time we get ahead, the rules change. That's because racism's goal is to, systematic racism's goal is to stay around. And the last thing
Nancy, absolutely. Do you want to address that? Just that it's like a virus and it kind of mutates and stays around.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, have we come to the conclusion of your comments, Nancy?
No, and I want to say one last thing, and this is
Go for it,
probably
Nancy.
going to be very unpopular. I think New York City made a mistake with having undocumented people vote. I think what they really needed to do, I think they chose the lower fruit. What they need to do is really try to work to get more documentation. I think that is going to come back and that's going to bite people in the butt and no one's going to be happy. That was a very bad mistake. And I think that the systematic racism structure that we have is going to further fracture relationships that people of color have within each other. And if people, I do not want to see that. I think that was a very bad mistake. And I know nobody, everybody wants to, but that was a mistake. And I think we're going to be sorry. New York City is going to be sorry that they did that. Because there's it's like people can come, from what I understand, people could come here, be here for 30 days, vote and go back home. That's not, they should be citizens to vote. And we need to work and scream and protest so that people who want to be citizens can become citizens. Because that's going to end up being some kind of purgatory that generations are going to stay in. And I could say more, but I'm not a panelist, but thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Nancy.
Nancy.
So I'll start. I mean, I'm gonna be, I will radically disagree with the idea that people who are part of the tax base, part of our communities shouldn't have access to dictate what the democracy says. I actually do agree a little bit that I don't agree that it's a bad idea. I live in the city, I support that. Me and my community members support that, and we will continue to support that and fight for our brothers and sisters who are not part of the documented system to have access to our democracy. So I'll say that. I 1000% agree with Nancy's point that white folks, have to collect each other, right? One of the crowning achievements of my work was getting a hit piece in the National Review, because I'm a racist against the whites, because I wrote this essay a long time ago called White Lips to White Ears, which is really just about a story where I was trying to explain racism to a white person. And then she was like, I don't get it. And anger, tears, all that stuff. And then I was like, I give up. I'm gonna drink some wine. And then my white friend literally like verbatim plagiarized me. I gave him permission to plagiarize, but literally said exactly what I said. And she was like, oh, and I was like, oh shit, okay, cool. I don't have to, that's not my job anymore, right? To sit here and explain American racism to white folks. And so I completely agree with Nancy's point that like white folks have so much labor to do. That does not mean, again, and I also want to name that like, the most racist stuff and the most anti-Black racist things I heard as a kid came from Mexican folks, right? So like we have work in our communities
That's
of
a
color.
whole second session.
Let's listen, right? So like all of us have work to do to flex and develop our racial literacy muscles, myself included, people in my community, my family. White folks have a lot more work to do because y'all haven't had to address it, right? Until like today or yesterday or a week ago or when Donald Trump got elected, right? So there's a lot more like exercise of that muscle that needs to happen. We have our routines, our exercise plans are just going to look a little different, right? And so I thank you, Nancy, for like naming that. Again, super disagree that like folks because they don't have papers shouldn't be allowed to vote, but understand the perspective.
Yeah, I'm not gonna respond to it directly. I just want to remind us all that like it's okay to not apologize for having an opinion you think won't be agreed with.
Right.
Like unpopular opinions are necessary. And so just a little note on framing, right? A couple of weeks ago, I was on a call with a woman who was talking about having an interaction with CPS, and her framing made me so sad. She just went on this litany of like legitimizing herself. I first want to say that I'm a homeowner in a private home and it's my home and I've worked on Wall Street before and I went to college and like, and, we're all on the Zoom, we can tell she's Black. And I'm like, sis, if you were addicted to 7 substances, had 6 kids with 5 different men and didn't have $1 to your name and CPS harmed you and took your kids, I would still fight for you. I still see you. So this is again, a practice of this legitimizing, right? People get up and spew unpopular opinions all the time and try to pass them off as fact, right? All the time. They're teaching CRT in the schools. Put your bodies on the line of fact. Like, what is that? What are you saying? So I just in general, just release ourselves from this, like, I know no one's gonna agree. You don't know. There could have been a lot of agreement in here. And I just hope that in saying that, there's not any unintentional internalizing of I'm alone. That's a strategy of the way we talk to each other, is that we say, I know this is unpopular, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It's you're not alone is all I'll say to that.
Thank you. We have one more and then we'll wrap.
Hi, my name is Tejas Sinchala. I'm the Executive Director of the Westchester County Human Rights Commission, and we're really proud to be a co-sponsor today. And I want to say thanks to Anne, Maria, and Matt for sharing your personal stories. It's not always easy to do that. And your insights. I think they're very valuable today. I just want to share a couple of things that we talked about. First, Matt, thanks for shouting out the importance of enforcing the fair housing law. I was one of the authors of the county's fair housing law in 2008. We have a very robust division. And in fact, the county's fair housing law prohibits discrimination based on citizenship status. It goes beyond the state. So if you are aware of somebody in the community that's being discriminated against in employment and housing or a place of public accommodation like a restaurant or a doctor's office based on their citizenship status, give us a call and let us know. One of the key points I just highlight for you talked about was we worked so hard to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, worked so hard to pass the Fair Housing Act of 1968, 1 week after Dr. King was assassinated. And there was never any conversation about what all that harm was caused in our society. We said, okay, from now on, this is illegal. You can't discriminate against an individual based on their race, their gender. But we never talked about what about all the years before and the decades before and the harm that caused in our society. And then the last thing I just to underscore about Heather's book is I was a civil rights attorney for 20 years before joining the Human Rights Commission. And one of my favorite cases involved representing a white co-op owner who tried to sell his unit to a young African-American applicant, and the co-op denied his purchase. And he had standing to bring a case because he was not the individual being discriminated against, but he was being harmed by the discrimination because he was unable to sell his unit. So he brought the claim. I represented him. Another attorney represented this purchaser. And, in the deposition, it came out, we don't want to sell to him because why does a 21-year-old African-American person have the money to buy this in cash? He must have done something illegal. What kind of friends does he have? What kind of parties is he going to have? And ultimately, we got a very good result. But it just goes to show how we're all impacted by racism and discrimination. And there are lots of things that we can do. And, I'm not as pessimistic, and I'm just generally an optimistic person. But I do see that the fact that there's so many people in this room and there's so much excitement throughout the county, when I talk to people, if you see something, to copy a line from New York City, if you see something, say something. So if you are aware of an issue, give us a call and let us know. And I want to just say thanks to Nicole and to everybody in CURE for putting this program together today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Beatrice.
So thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. And I want to let you know that if you want to get involved with us or learn more, we're at www.learnwithcure.com. Also, we can only bring free programming because of our neighbors' generous donations. So please donate. For people who are online, there will be a survey in the chat. We ask you please to take the survey so we know how to improve our programming. And the people who are in the room will get an email with a survey link. And we have one more event in our series. Our final event is going to be next Sunday. Please join us at the New Rochelle Library on March 27th at 2:00 to see Heather McGhee, see and hear Heather McGhee beamed in virtually with 4 live moderators and live audience questions from Ms. McGhee. There are, of course, virtual options, but we'd love to see people in the room. I think that really makes a difference. The Ossie Davis Theater at the New Rochelle Library will be seated at half capacity with masks optional. So we hope to see everyone here next Sunday. And thank you again very much. Thanks to our panelists.
Finally. Couldn't get on that.
Thanks, everyone.